1918, a journal surfaced that wasn't meant to be read. It described something so large the river itself seemed to breathe around it. 3 men entered the Amazon to prove a myth wrong. Only one came back sane enough to write, and even he begged that the pages be burned. They told us the Amazon is loud. They lied. Sometimes it listens. The river doesn't rush out here. It waits thick, dark, slow as a held breath. And in March of 1918, that breath wrapped itself around 3 men who believed science made them untouchable. Richard Hale Lewis was 28, freshly educated and dangerously confident. He believed the jungle could be measured, cataloged, reduced to notes in a leather journal. When locals spoke of a serpent longer than boats and thicker than trees, Lewis smiled politely and wrote the word myth in the margins. That smile would not survive the river. The expedition left the last rubber outpost at dawn, paddling into tributaries so narrow the trees leaned inward like they were conspiring. The water was black, not muddy, not dirty, black like ink poured over secrets. Every stroke of the paddle felt like disturbing something that had been still for centuries. By the 3rd week, the jungle stopped feeling alive and started feeling aware. The green was wrong. Not comforting. Not natural. It pressed in. Crawled into lungs. Into thoughts. Lewis wrote that even his dreams had turned the color of leaves rotting underwater. The men spoke less. Laughed never. Sound behaved strangely there, traveling too far or not far enough. And then the smell came. Not rot, not death. Something sweeter, thicker, as if the river had swallowed something enormous and was slowly remembering it. Carlos Mendez noticed first. Carlos had survived expeditions that didn't survive themselves. He moved through the forest without disturbing it, like smoke through wire. When he stopped paddling mid-current, Lewis wanted to argue, until he smelled it too. Something upstream had died. Or something upstream was feeding. They made camp on a sandbar where the river split, a place that felt accidentally spared. Fire, canvas, hammocks, a fragile human geometry, drawn against infinite green. Lewis called it a neutral observation point. Carlos didn't call it anything. That first night, the jungle screamed as usual. Insects, birds, life feeding on life. But beneath it all, there was a pause. A gap in the noise that came and went like blinking eyes. Lewis told himself it was imagination. The days passed in a rhythm that pretended to be normal. Morning howler monkeys. Afternoon heat so heavy it crushed thought. Evenings cataloging specimens by lantern light. They saw anacondas, real ones. 15 feet, 18 thick, powerful. Lewis felt vindicated. These are the giants, he wrote. Everything else is exaggeration. Carlos didn't argue. He only said, these hunt in the shallows. That night, the dragging sound began. Not loud, not sudden. A slow, deliberate pull across wet sand, as if something heavy was being drawn from water to land. Then reconsidered. It lasted half a minute. Lewis didn't sleep after. The sound returned the next night, and the next, always circling. Never rushing, always patient. The jungle's noise dimmed when it happened, like the forest was leaning back to make room. By the 4th night, Carlos said the words Lewis dreaded. We move camp. Lewis refused. Another month, he insisted. Just 1 more month. The Smithsonian needed evidence, measurements, proof, history, favored those who stayed. Carlos looked at him the way men look at floods. The next morning, they found the tree. It hadn't fallen. It had been destroyed. An 80-foot giant lay snapped like a bone, its trunk crushed inward, not splintered outward. No storm, no wind. The earth beneath it was smooth, compressed, curved, wrapped. Lewis measured the depression twice, then a 3rd time, hands trembling despite himself. 2 feet wide. Nothing in his textbooks matched that math. Jam Pereira, the youngest, strongest among them, crossed himself without shame. He whispered a name the missionaries never wrote down. A name that meant mother of deep water. Lewis laughed. The laugh echoed badly. That night, Carlos built the fire higher than ever before. Flames clawed upward, defiant. The jungle answered by going quiet. Not silent, watchful. Then Lewis saw the shadow. It slid across the trees on the far bank, stretching and stretching and stretching, taking too long to pass. 15 seconds of uninterrupted movement. Lewis counted. He couldn't stop counting. The head turned broad, triangular, curious. No one spoke. When the shadow finally dissolved back into darkness, something fundamental broke inside Lewis, not fear, certainty. the certainty that they were no longer observers. They were marked. As dawn arrived, warm and deceptively gentle, Lewis wrote one final confident sentence in his journal. "We will stay." He underlined it twice. He did not know the river had already decided otherwise. By daylight, the jungle pretended nothing had happened. By nightfall, it corrected that lie. Morning arrived like forgiveness. Sunlight burned the mist off the river, turning fear into something that almost felt childish. In the clean clarity of dawn, Lewis convinced himself the shadow had been an illusion. Firelight and exhaustion conspiring against reason. This is how the Amazon wins. It lets you feel safe just long enough to make the wrong decision permanent. Carlos didn't argue anymore. He simply worked. He cut sightlines through brush with careful precision, opening narrow corridors between camp and riverbank, not wide enough to invite anything in, just wide enough to see it coming. Jam reinforced the fire pit with heavier stones and dragged deadwood into neat stacks, his movements efficient, silent. No one joked. No one sang. Lewis documented everything. Measurements, sketches, soil compression. The broken tree. He told himself this was what courage looked like, standing your ground, when fear tried to dress itself as wisdom. But his handwriting betrayed him. Lines wavered. Numbers smudged. Several pages had to be rewritten where his pencil slipped. By afternoon, they noticed something else missing. Caimans. Where the mud banks had once been crowded with armored bodies basking in the sun, there were now only empty impressions. No tracks leading away. No signs of migration, just absence. Jam squatted at the river's edge, staring at the water as if it might speak. "They don't leave," he said quietly. "They disappear." Lewis suggested drought patterns, territory shifts, anything that sounded academic. Carlos said nothing, but he counted the remaining bullets in his rifle twice. The second tree fell just before dusk. They heard it this time. Not the crash of wind or thunder, but a deep, wet crack, followed by a slow groan as if the forest itself were protesting. When they reached the north bank, the tree lay crushed inward, folded like soft clay. The ground around it sloped smoothly into the river. A massive slide pressed flat by impossible weight. At the bottom of that slide, Lewis saw something half buried in silt. A scale. He knelt, lifted it carefully. It was the size of his palm, thick, heavy, patterned with dark blotches that swallowed light, instead of reflecting it. This was not shed skin. This had been torn away. Jam backed up immediately, hands moving in a rapid blessing. "You shouldn't touch that," he whispered. "It will know." Lewis wrapped the scale in cloth anyway. Science demanded evidence. Fear demanded obedience. Lewis chose science and felt the jungle notice. That night, Carlos insisted the specimen box be buried away from camp. "Animals follow scent," he said. "Especially old ones." Lewis agreed reluctantly. It felt like compromise. It wasn't. The dragging sound began before full darkness. This time it didn't wander. It circled, south, east, north. Each pass was closer, more deliberate, like fingers tracing the edge of a wound. The fire snapped loudly, kerosene feeding the flames into something almost violent. Shadows leapt across the trees, stretching and collapsing. The jungle's usual noise thinned. Insects dulled, birds cut themselves off mid-call, and beneath it all came another sound. Breathing. Slow, deep, measured. Not panting. Not effort. The breathing of something that had never needed to hurry. Carlos whispered directions without turning his head. Southeast. 30 feet. "Don't move fast." Lewis felt sweat crawl down his spine. Every instinct screamed to run, but there is nowhere to run. When the forest itself is the wall, then it moved. The head emerged first. Even partially hidden, it was enormous, easily 3 feet wide. Triangular, armored in thick overlapping scales. Its eyes reflected the firelight with no emotion at all. No hunger, no rage. Assessment. The body followed, thicker than any barrel Lewis had ever seen. It flowed forward without sound, muscle sliding beneath skin like a river current made solid. Patterns along its length seemed to shift as it moved. Designed not for beauty but disappearance. This was not a monster. This was an apex. The head lifted, swayed. The tongue flicked out, long, black forked, tasting heat. Scent fear. Lewis understood in that moment that it was not reacting. It was deciding. Jam made a sound. A broken prayer. Carlos raised the rifle slowly, finger resting but not tightening. He knew what Lewis knew. A wound would not stop this. It would only teach it. Time stretched. Seconds thickened. Then, almost lazily, the head turned away. The body followed, reversing with impossible grace, slipping back into shadow, until the jungle closed behind it as if nothing had passed through. No one exhaled until the breathing faded. They did not sleep. Dawn came again, traitorous and warm. The snake had not attacked. Lewis took this as proof that caution, fire, reason could coexist with danger. Carlos saw it differently. This was a warning, he said. It knows we're here. It knows we saw it. It's deciding if we're worth the effort. Lewis argued that predators conserve energy, that large animals avoid unnecessary risk, that this encounter supported his hypothesis of exaggerated fear. Carlos let him finish. Then why, he asked quietly, did it come onto land at all? Lewis had no answer. By midday, the river changed. The water level dropped, not gradually, but suddenly, as if something upstream had displaced volume simply by passing through. The current slowed. Fish vanished. Even the smell shifted, thickening until it coated the back of the throat. Jam refused to leave the fire's edge. Lewis tried to focus on his notes, but his thoughts kept returning to the scale buried across camp, to the way the creature had lifted its head, not to strike, but to see. That night, the dragging sound did not circle. It approached directly, closer than before. So close Lewis could feel vibration through the sandbar, subtle tremors like distant thunder trapped underground. The fire flared as if reacting, flames bending inward. Carlos whispered the words Lewis feared most. It's coming back. And this time, Lewis realized it wasn't curious. It was committed. The second visit was curiosity. The third was preparation. The Amazon does not rush its kills. That realization settled over the camp, like ash after a fire. Heavy. Inevitable. The ground itself felt different beneath our feet that evening. No longer neutral soil, but something claimed, something measured. Lewis wrote later that night, though he never remembered deciding to. His hand moved on its own, scribbling observations that read less like science and more like confession. Predators escalate, he noted. They test boundaries. Then they remove them. The jungle agreed. Just before dusk, Carlos found the rope line snapped on the western edge of camp. Not torn, not frayed, pressed flat into the sand, as if something enormous had slid over it. Without noticing, it was there. It walked through, Jam whispered. Carlos corrected him. It passed through. They doubled the fire again, burning wood they'd planned to save. Smoke rose thick and bitter, clinging to the trees. Lewis knew what Carlos was doing, making the camp visible from above, from the water, from everywhere. If the snake came again, it would not be by accident. Night fell quickly, like someone shutting a door. At first, nothing happened. The jungle held its breath so completely that Lewis became aware of his own pulse. He could hear blood in his ears. The fire popped, sending sparks upward like frantic signals. Then came the sound. Not dragging. Sliding. Wet, massive, continuous. It wasn't circling anymore. It was repositioning. Carlos tracked it by sound alone, slowly rotating, rifle following invisible movement through the darkness. It's in the water, he murmured. Moving parallel. Using the current. Lewis swallowed. Why? Carlos didn't answer immediately. Because water is where it's strongest, he finally said. And because it's learned our fire. The river responded with a sudden ripple, too wide, too deliberate. The surface bulged briefly, as if something enormous had rolled just beneath it. Then stillness. Jam back toward the fire, machete raised with both hands. His lips moved faster now, prayers overlapping, languages colliding. Lewis wanted to tell him to stop. That sound mattered, but fear had stolen authority from language. The first strike didn't come from the water. It came from behind them. The ground shook as something slammed into the tree line north of camp. Branches exploded outward. Leaves rained down. The impact wasn't fast, it was controlled. Measured force applied with terrifying precision. A tree bent, not fell. Bent, its trunk bowed inward as if hugged by something unseen. Wood screamed. Roots tore free with a wet, ripping sound. Then the tree snapped, crashing down exactly where the firelight was weakest. Lewis stared, frozen as the impossible became undeniable. This wasn't hunting. This was landscape modification. Carlos shouted, "Fire, now!" Jam grabbed a kerosene can and hurled its contents toward the fallen tree. Carlos fired, not at the creature but into the air. The explosion of sound tore through the silence, echoing wildly. Lewis struck a match with shaking fingers and threw it. Flame roared outward, licking up the crushed trunk, illuminating the body. Only a section of it, but enough. Scales the size of shields, overlapped along a curve so wide, Lewis couldn't see where it ended. Muscle shifted beneath them, rippling like slow machinery. The body moved not forward, not back, but around the fire, testing heat the way a hand tests water. Then the head emerged again. Closer, much closer. The eyes reflected firelight and something else, recognition. Not of individuals, of patterns. Lewis understood with sick clarity that it remembered the fire from the night before. Remembered the hesitation. Remembered that they hadn't fled. The tongue flicked again. Once. Twice. The air felt tight, stolen. Lewis couldn't breathe properly. He realized he was standing directly between the fire and the water, the worst possible place. Carlos saw it too. Move, he whispered. Slow. Lewis took one step. The ground erupted. The tail struck from the darkness, slamming into the sandbar where Lewis had been standing a second earlier. The impact sent a shockwave through the camp, knocking Jam off, his feet and extinguishing part of the fire in a hiss of steam and smoke. This was no warning. This was a correction. The snake surged forward slightly, not charging, not attacking, but asserting presence. Its head rose higher than before, towering now, mouth parting just enough to reveal curved teeth designed not for tearing, but holding. Lewis felt his reason collapse. This thing did not need to rush. It could wait them out, crush them one by one, drag them into the water where sound and fire meant nothing. Carlos fired then, directly into the ground in front of the head. The bullet sparked off stone, the sound deafening. The snake recoiled slightly, more surprised than hurt. It drew back a few feet, body sliding smoothly, silently. The fire caught again, brighter now, wild and uneven. For a moment, only a moment, Lewis thought it might retreat. Instead, it did something far worse. It stopped moving. The head lowered, rested against the earth. The body stilled completely, blending into shadow and smoke until only the eyes remained visible, waiting. Predators chase prey. Apex predators let prey exhaust itself. Minutes passed. No movement. No sound. The jungle's noise began to creep back in, tentative, confused. Insects resumed. A bird called once, then stopped. Jam sobbed quietly. Lewis realized his legs were numb. He didn't remember falling to his knees. Carlos never lowered the rifle. Finally, slowly, the eyes blinked. The head withdrew inch by inch, dissolving into darkness. The body followed, its passage barely disturbing the ground now, as if it had learned exactly how much pressure to apply. When it was gone, the river resumed flowing as though nothing had happened. No one spoke for a long time. At dawn, Carlos packed his gear without discussion. "We leave," he said flatly. "Now." Lewis wanted to argue, wanted to cling to purpose, to notes, to proof. But as he looked around the camp at crushed earth, broken trees, scorched ground, he understood something finally. They hadn't survived an attack. They'd survived a decision, and next time the decision might be different. As they pushed the canoe into the river, Lewis felt it. A shift, a subtle pull in the current, as if something deep below had turned and was following them too easily. That was the first sign Lewis should have understood, but didn't. The canoe slid free of the sandbar without resistance, gliding into the black channel as if guided. No branches snagged, no roots clawed at the hull. The current carried them forward with a gentleness that felt rehearsed. Carlos paddled first. Jam followed. Lewis sat in the center, journal clutched to his chest like it might anchor him to reason. No one spoke. Behind them, the camp vanished into green within minutes, erased so completely it felt unreal. Smoke thinned, firelight died, and with it the illusion that leaving meant safety. The Amazon teaches a cruel lesson. Land gives warnings, water gives none. They paddled for hours in silence, following the tributary downstream toward what Carlos insisted was a wider channel, faster water, fewer ambush points. Lewis wanted to believe him. He wanted to believe that movement alone broke patterns, but patterns were exactly what the river excelled at. Half a mile downstream, the current changed. Not direction, pressure. The canoe slowed, though Carlos paddled harder. The water beneath them felt thick, resistant, like pushing through oil. Small ripples formed along the surface, too wide, too synchronized to be wind. Jam noticed first. He stopped paddling. "Something's under us," he whispered. Carlos didn't look down. He looked ahead. His face tightened, jaw locking into a shape Lewis had never seen before. "Don't stop," Carlos said. "Whatever you feel, don't stop." The canoe lurched, not violently. Not enough to tip, just a subtle lift, like riding over a submerged log. Except there were no logs here. The channel was deep, measured deep. Lewis had taken soundings himself. Another lift followed, longer this time. The water beside the canoe bulged outward, forming a slow, deliberate curve that traveled parallel to them. The surface tension bent around an invisible mass. Lewis understood then. It wasn't following behind them. It was pacing them. The breathing returned, not loud, not threatening. A low expansion and contraction that seemed to come from the river itself. Lewis's stomach dropped as he realized. The sound carried through water better than air. Carlos hissed. "If it hits us here, we don't fight. We abandon." "With what?" Lewis asked hoarsely. "With whatever's left of us," Carlos replied. The river narrowed ahead. Trees leaned closer. Exposed roots clawed into the channel like grasping hands. The canoe scraped bark on both sides as they passed through. Then the water exploded. The impact came from below, slamming the canoe upward and sideways. Wood groaned. Jam cried out as his paddle flew from his hands. Lewis was thrown against the gunwale, journal slipping into the water before he could stop it. The canoe did not capsize. It was lifted. For one impossible second, Lewis saw it. Just beneath the surface, a massive curve of muscle and scale sliding under them, supporting their weight like a living bridge. Then it rolled. The canoe flipped. Cold black water swallowed everything. Lewis went under screaming, lungs burning instantly as the current dragged him down. Something brushed his leg, smooth, powerful, moving with terrifying certainty. He kicked blindly, scraping against the canoe's overturned hull. He broke the surface gasping, choking on river water that tasted like rot and metal. Carlos was already shouting. Jam thrashed nearby, eyes wide with animal panic. The canoe drifted a few feet away, half submerged, spinning slowly. Then the head broke the surface. Closer than ever. Water cascaded off it as it rose, revealing scars Lewis hadn't seen before. Old wounds, pale and twisted, crossing its scales. Proof of age. Proof of survival. This thing had fought rivers, storms, and men long before Lewis was born. The eyes locked onto Jam, not randomly, precisely. The body surged. Jam screamed as coils wrapped around his torso, lifting him clean out of the water. The pressure crushed sound from his chest, turning his cry into a wet rasp. His machete slipped from his grip and vanished. Lewis watched, paralyzed, as Jam was drawn inward, folded against the massive body like a child's toy. Carlos fired. The shot cracked the air, echoing uselessly. The bullet struck scale and deflected with a sharp spark, leaving only a shallow gouge. The snake didn't react. Jam's bones gave way with a sound Lewis would hear in dreams for the rest of his life. Then the water closed. The snake submerged with its prize, leaving only violent ripples and a spreading red stain that vanished almost immediately into the black current. Silence followed. Not shock silence. Completion. Lewis clung to the canoe, sobbing, retching, mind unraveling. Carlos grabbed him by the collar and hauled him closer. "Listen to me," Carlos said fiercely. "It fed, that buys us time." "How much?" Lewis choked. Carlos didn't answer. They righted the canoe with shaking hands and pulled themselves back in. Soaked, bleeding, stripped of equipment. Jam was gone. Half their supplies were gone. The journal, Lewis's proof, his career was gone. The river flowed on, indifferent. They paddled without stopping until their arms failed, until daylight began to thin and shadows stretched again across the water. Neither man looked behind them. At dusk, Carlos pulled them into a shallow inlet and forced the canoe into reeds. "We don't light a fire," he said. "We don't speak unless we have to." Lewis nodded numbly. That night the river moved differently. Something large shifted beneath the surface upstream, displacing water in slow pulses. Lewis lay curled in the canoe, staring at the stars through gaps in the canopy, unable to cry anymore. He understood now. This wasn't a random encounter. This wasn't territorial defense. This was an old predator responding to intrusion, the only way it ever had, by removing variables. Jam had been a calculation, and Lewis knew with horrifying clarity that the calculation wasn't finished. Because before dawn, as mist rolled low across the water, Lewis felt the canoe drift just slightly despite no current. Something nudged it. Gently. Testing from below. It had eaten, but it hadn't finished. The nudge came again. Soft, careful, almost curious. Lewis froze, every muscle locked, afraid that even breathing might ripple the water. The canoe drifted a few inches, reeds whispering against the hull. Carlos opened one eye, then the other, not moving his head. "Don't react," he mouthed. The Amazon before dawn feels unfinished. Shapes exist without edges. Sounds travel without sources. Lewis could hear his own heartbeat louder than the insects. The water around them trembled faintly. Not from current, but from displacement. Something large adjusting position beneath them. The canoe rose slightly, then settled. Carlos tightened his grip on the rifle, though Lewis knew how useless it was now. A weapon is only comforting when it still has meaning. The surface of the river broke 20 feet away, not violently. Deliberately. The head emerged again, lower this time, barely lifting above the waterline. Only the eyes and crown were visible, dark and patient. It didn't rush. It didn't threaten. It watched. Lewis understood the horror of that moment more than any attack. Predators that strike can be feared. Predators that observe are calculating future outcomes. The eyes shifted from canoe to reeds, to the bank. "Planning," Carlos whispered. "It's deciding if we're worth the energy." Lewis almost laughed. The sound died in his throat. The snake submerged again, vanishing so smoothly the surface barely rippled. Minutes passed, 10, maybe 20. The dawn crept closer, light thinning the darkness just enough to sharpen fear instead of dull it. Lewis dared to hope. Then the water ahead of them swelled. The body rose just beneath the surface, stretching across the channel like a living dam. The canoe was pulled forward not by current, but by suction, water displaced by mass moving underneath. Carlos cursed under his breath. "It's hurting us," he said. Toward the bank. Toward land. The canoe bumped mud and roots. Carlos shoved them back with his paddle, but resistance increased instantly. The water felt wrong, heavy again, as if the river itself had decided to cooperate. The head surfaced beside them, close enough that Lewis could see scars along its jaw, close enough to smell it, wet earth, old blood, something ancient and chemical. The mouth opened slightly, not to bite, to breathe. The exhalation rippled the water, warm and foul. Lewis's vision blurred as panic surged. This wasn't hunger. This was dominance, the kind that doesn't need to prove itself. Carlos made his choice. He fired, not at the head, but into the water directly beneath it. The sound cracked like thunder. The shockwave traveled through the river, startling fish, birds, everything. The snake recoiled sharply this time, body tightening, coils flexing beneath the surface. The canoe lurched free. "Now," Carlos shouted. They paddled with everything left, arms screaming, muscles tearing. The river widened suddenly, opening into faster water. The current grabbed them greedily, pulling them downstream. Behind them, the surface exploded. The snake surged forward in pursuit, not fast but unstoppable. The wake it threw spread bank to bank, water folding over itself. Lewis glanced back once. The head was higher now, angry, committed. Carlos shouted over the roar. "When it hits the rapids, it loses leverage. That's our chance." Lewis barely understood. He only paddled. The canoe slammed into churning water, bouncing violently as rocks scraped the hull. Spray blinded them. The river roared, finally loud enough to drown fear. The snake followed until it didn't. At the edge of the rapids, the water erupted one final time as the massive body coiled, then stopped. The head rose, watching them tumble away, eyes unreadable. Then it sank. Gone. The rapids carried them miles before spitting them into calmer water. By the time Carlos forced the canoe ashore, both men were shaking uncontrollably, hands raw, bodies bruised. They collapsed on the bank, laughing and crying in the same breath. The hysterical relief of survivors who don't yet understand what survival costs. Carlos stopped laughing first. "It let us go," he said quietly. Lewis frowned. "We escaped." Carlos shook his head slowly. "No, we were released." Lewis didn't want to hear that. He stared at the water, at the way the surface smoothed itself so perfectly, erasing all sign of what had passed. They continued downstream for days, avoiding narrow channels, avoiding islands, avoiding anywhere that felt enclosed. Food ran low. Sleep came in fragments. Every sound in the water made Lewis flinch. Eventually, they reached another outpost. People listened. Some nodded. Some crossed themselves. No one laughed. Lewis returned home months later, thinner, quieter, older than his years. He submitted his report to the Smithsonian. It was rejected. Exaggerated, they wrote. Emotionally compromised. Lewis did not argue. He burned his remaining notes. But one page he kept. On it, written in shaking ink, were the last words he ever recorded about the Amazon. Some predators don't kill because they must. They kill to remind you where you stand. Years later, Lewis would wake in the night, certain he could hear it again. That slow, patient breathing, coming from water that should have been still. The world rejected his story, but the river didn't. After the outpost, Lewis tried to return to normal life. He couldn't. The jungle had already claimed a piece of him, and every quiet moment became a reminder that something in the Amazon still knew his name. He went back to his old routines, letters, lectures, meetings, but his mind kept drifting to the black water, to the way the snake had watched him, not just hunted him. He kept imagining the eyes beneath the surface, the slow breathing, the patient intelligence. People called it trauma. Lewis called it truth. He tried to bury the experience. But the Amazon doesn't bury. It waits. And it waits in a way that feels like time itself has been altered. Weeks after he returned, he received a package. No return address, no stamp. Just a wrapped bundle of leather tied with twine. Inside was a single object, a scale. The same pattern, same thick dark olive color, the size of a palm. The surface slightly glossy as if it had been kept wet. Lewis's stomach dropped. His hands trembled so badly he almost dropped it again. The scale was not from the Amazon. It was from his camp. It had been buried deeply, across the river from where they slept, hidden on purpose away from their scent. And yet, it had returned. He read the note underneath the scale. One line, no signature. You left something behind. Lewis tried to convince himself it was a hoax, a prank, a cruel joke from someone who'd heard the story and wanted to mock him. But the handwriting matched his own. Not perfectly, not exactly, but enough to make his blood freeze, because it wasn't just the shape of the letters. It was the fear behind them. The fear of someone who had been watching the river for weeks after the expedition ended. The fear of someone who had never truly left the Amazon. Lewis began to notice things, small things. The sound of water in the walls of his house like a river far below. The way his dreams became wet and heavy, as if he were drowning in sleep. The way he could smell green rot in the air even in winter. He told himself it was guilt. It wasn't. It was a message. The snake was not satisfied with just killing. It wanted proof. It wanted Lewis to know that it could reach him anywhere. So Lewis did the only thing he knew how to do. He wrote again. Not for the Smithsonian, not for fame, for the world, for anyone who might come after him and make the same mistake. He wrote a new report. He described the river, the trees, the smell, the sound. He described the shadow that had moved like liquid. He described the tree that had been crushed. He described the dragging sound that circled camp like a predator testing a fence. And he described the creature, not as a myth, not as a legend, as a living, breathing force. But when he tried to publish it, he was met with the same rejection. Too sensational, too exaggerated, not scientifically credible. Lewis realized then that the world didn't want to believe. Not because the story was impossible, but because it was true. Because if it was real, it meant something in the world still existed that humans could not control. Something older than science. Something that didn't care about proof. Something that hunted by patience. Months later, Lewis received another note. This one was different. No scale. Just words. The river remembers. Lewis stared at those words until they blurred. He understood what the snake had done. It had marked him. Not with teeth, with memory. And now every time he looked at water, he could feel it looking back. He tried to leave the city. He tried to move to a place without rivers, without lakes, without any surface water at all. But water is everywhere, in pipes and clouds, in the air. And the river didn't need to be in sight to be present, because the snake was not just in the Amazon. It was in the idea of the Amazon, in the fear of the unknown, in the part of the human mind that knows there are places we should never enter. That is what the snake fed on. That is what it wanted. And then one night Lewis woke up to the sound of water in his bedroom. Not dripping, not leaking, flowing like a river running through his walls. He sat up. The air smelled green, and in the darkness he saw it, a shadow moving beneath the floorboards, slow, patient, waiting, as if the river itself had decided to come to him. He whispered, barely audible, "It's here," and the darkness seemed to answer, not with sound, but with movement, something heavy sliding deep under the ground, something that didn't need to bite to kill, because it had already taken what it wanted, and now it was coming to finish the job. He thought the river was far away, but the river had already reached him. Lewis sat frozen, listening to the sound under his floorboards. Not water, not a leak, something bigger, something alive. His breath became shallow, like he was trying not to be heard. The room felt too small, as if the walls were closing in. The air itself seemed wet. He realized with a cold shock that the smell wasn't just green, it was fresh. Like the jungle after rain, like the river after feeding. He forced himself out of bed. His feet touched the floor and he felt it immediately. Vibration. A slow, rhythmic pressure that matched the breathing he had heard in the Amazon. It wasn't in the walls. It was in the earth. He moved to the window and looked out. The city was quiet. The street lamps painted the pavement in orange circles. People slept. Cars were parked. Everything looked normal. But the river was beneath them all. He returned to the center of the room and placed his hand on the floor. Palm flat, fingers spread. The vibration traveled through his skin, through bone, through fear. It felt like the heartbeat of something enormous. Lewis remembered the snake's eyes in the Amazon. Calm, patient, intelligent. The eyes of a predator that didn't need to rush. He whispered, "You're here." The floor shifted slightly beneath his hand. He jerked back, heart hammering. The vibration stopped. For a moment, silence returned. Then the sound of water returned too, louder, closer, as if the river had taken a step forward. Lewis understood the truth in the most terrifying way possible. The snake didn't need to travel. It only needed to remember. He rushed to his desk and grabbed his journal, the only remaining proof he had. His hands shook as he flipped through pages, searching for a sentence he couldn't stop thinking about. Some predators don't kill because they must. They kill to remind you where you stand. The words felt like a warning from a man who had already been punished. Lewis began to pack. He grabbed clothes, papers, anything he could carry quickly. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to move. He had to leave the water behind. But as he reached for his coat, he heard something else. A sound outside. Not footsteps. A wet, sliding sound like something huge moving across pavement. Lewis froze, listening. The sound came closer. He moved to the window again, heart pounding. At the edge of the street in the dim light, he saw a shadow. Not a person. A shape that didn't belong. Something long and thick, moving slowly like a river on land. It glided past the streetlights, leaving darkness in its wake. Lewis's mind tried to refuse what he was seeing. But his eyes didn't lie. The creature had followed him. Not by river, not by water, by memory. The shadow disappeared around the corner. Lewis knew it was heading toward the nearest body of water, the city river that ran through town. It wasn't hunting him for food. It was hunting him for proof, for validation, for the satisfaction of showing the world that its existence wasn't a myth. Lewis ran out of the house. He didn't stop to lock doors. He didn't stop to call anyone. He didn't stop to think. He ran down the street, toward the river. The night air was cold, but his skin felt hot, as if he were running through steam. His breath came in ragged bursts. His mind was a tornado of fear and disbelief. When he reached the riverbank, he saw it. The water was calm, reflecting the streetlights like a broken mirror. And in the water, the surface was disturbed. Something massive moved beneath. The air smelled like wet jungle. Then the water rose, slowly, like a hand lifting out of the river. The head emerged, not as high as in the Amazon, but still enormous, still impossible. Its eyes found Lewis. And for the first time, Lewis realized the worst part of the whole story. The creature didn't need the Amazon to be dangerous. It only needed human water. It could live anywhere. It could be anywhere. The snake rose further, body following, revealing a length that seemed to stretch beyond the riverbank, beyond the street, beyond the night itself. The creature's tongue flicked out, and Lewis understood with a sudden, sick clarity that this wasn't the first time it had done this. It had already been here. Before. Waiting, learning, watching, and now it was ready to finish what it had started. Carlos had warned him. The Amazon doesn't grade on a curve. It only measures whether you're paying attention. Lewis was paying attention now, but it was too late. The river had already remembered him, and the creature was coming for the final proof. The final chapter wasn't about escape. It was about what the river wanted from him. The creature's head lifted higher, casting a shadow over the riverbank like a moving eclipse. Its eyes locked onto Lewis with the calm certainty of something that knew the outcome before the first step was taken. The city lights reflected in its scales, making it look even more unreal, like a dream someone had forgotten to wake from. Lewis stood frozen, heart pounding so hard it felt like the river was beating inside his chest. He remembered the Amazon, the camp, the dragging sound, the crushed trees, the shadow moving across the riverbank, jam being pulled under. Carlos's voice, sharp, desperate warning. And now here it was again. But this time he wasn't in the jungle. He was in civilization, and that made it worse. Because if the creature could appear here, it meant no place was safe. The head moved closer, slow, controlled. The tongue flicked out once. Lewis could feel the heat of its breath. A terrible thought crossed his mind. If it could come here, then it could come for anyone. Not just him, for everyone. He stumbled back, trying to put distance between them. His feet slipped on wet grass. The creature didn't hurry. It didn't need to. It had already won the moment he saw it. Lewis heard something behind him. A voice. Carlos. He had followed him. Or maybe he had been here all along. Maybe he had never truly left the river. Carlos stepped out from behind a tree, rifle in hand, eyes filled with the kind of dread that comes from facing a force you cannot defeat. You brought it here, Carlos said, not accusing, just stating a fact. I didn't, Lewis began. Carlos cut him off. You wrote about it. You published the story. You made it real. Lewis's throat tightened. They rejected me. They called me crazy. Carlos shook his head slowly. They didn't reject you. They protected themselves. You made it visible. The creature moved closer, body partially submerged, still massive enough to make the river feel small. Carlos raised the rifle. This is the only way, he said. Lewis shook his head. It doesn't work. Carlos's eyes flicked toward the water. Then we do what it fears most. Lewis stared at him, confused. Carlos lowered the rifle and reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small glass vial filled with kerosene. Fire, he said. Lewis's mind raced. You think fire will stop it? Carlos nodded. Not stop, scare, confuse, make it think the river is not safe. Make it think the water is not its home. Lewis hesitated, then nodded. He understood now that there was no escape, only delay. They poured the kerosene onto the riverbank, creating a slick, shining trail. Carlos struck a match. The flame leapt. The fire spread quickly across the grass, fueled by the kerosene. The heat rose in waves. The creature hissed, a sound that wasn't quite a hiss, not quite a roar. It was the noise of a predator offended. The head withdrew slightly as if the fire had touched a nerve. Its eyes narrowed. The tongue flicked faster, tasting the air. Carlos shouted, now! Lewis grabbed a branch and threw it into the fire, creating a larger blaze. The flames climbed higher, reaching toward the creature. For a moment it seemed to hesitate. Then the water trembled. The creature turned, body sliding back into the river with incredible speed, as if the fire had reminded it that water was still its domain. Lewis exhaled a shaky breath. Carlos didn't relax. He kept staring at the river, watching the surface. The creature didn't leave. It stayed just beneath the surface, watching, waiting, as if it was deciding whether to return. Carlos spoke quietly. It won't come back tonight. Lewis asked, why? Carlos looked at him, eyes tired. Because it learned something. Lewis waited. Carlos continued. It learned that the river isn't safe anymore. Lewis stared at the dark water. So it leaves? Carlos shook his head. No. He stepped closer to the riverbank, lowering his voice. It moves. Lewis felt a chill. Carlos said, the river doesn't have to stay here. It can be anywhere there's water. Lewis's mind raced. You mean? Carlos nodded. It can choose another river, another lake, another city. Lewis's heart sank. The creature had already proved it. The fire had not stopped it. It had only made it relocate. And Lewis realized the final horror. The snake didn't need to kill him. It only needed to prove it could. It only needed to show that the river could reach any place on Earth. Carlos looked at Louis one last time. "Tell the world," he said, "not to believe me, but to fear the water." Louis nodded slowly, understanding the truth in Carlos's words. The creature disappeared beneath the surface. The water calmed, the fire burned out, and the city returned to its quiet, sleeping state, unaware that something ancient had just chosen a new home. Louis walked away from the river, carrying the weight of the knowledge like a stone in his chest. He never stopped hearing the sound of water. He never stopped smelling green rot. And every time he saw a river, a lake, or even a puddle, the creature that had learned how to leave